I'm Insomniac, and this is the Orient Enforcer. Okay, so this is model SEZ07001BO, or is that a 0? I think that's an O. Either way, that model's too long, but that's what this is. First thing I'd like to do is give a big shout out to Don from Pittsfield, Massachusetts for sending this in. This is actually one of his personal pieces, which he sent in for me to review and send back. And as a side note, for anybody watching who has interesting pieces at home that you'd like to see me review on this channel, you could always do the same thing, send them in, I'll review them, send them back. Just email me at shouldItimethis@gmail.com. I'll put it somewhere there on the screen. So anyway, again, big shout out to Don, thank you very much. Okay, let's get right into it. The packaging for the Orient Enforcer is simple, clean, classic, and well presented. After you remove the sleeve, you have a glossy cream-colored box with the Orient logo. Inside, you'd normally find the watch displayed on this soft cushion, and under there you have your paperwork, which for some reason seems to be disguised as a book of matches or something. A couple of Orient tags, and of course your spare links for the bracelet. Nothing fancy or extravagant, but it's just enough to be presentable. The case of this watch is stainless steel and measures 44 millimeters in diameter, not including the crown and crown guard, a little over 13 millimeters thick, and a respectable 49.5 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip. The finishing of the case is very well done, with a good machining and a nice brushed finish for the sides and lug tops, which is broken up by a polished bevel connecting those two sections, and then a fully polished screw-down case back with an exhibition window so you can see the movement, which we'll talk about later. And around the exhibition window there are some general pieces of information about the watch, such as the top glass material, the 100-meter water resistance rating,
where the f is the boat,
the model number, case material, and made in Japan. Back up to the top of the watch and you'll notice a well-polished black bezel, which almost has a ceramic look to it, although I'm fairly certain that it's not, being that there's no mention about anything on this watch being ceramic. Around the outside of the bezel there are two finely machined grooves, which add a nice texture and further separate the bezel from the rest of the watch visually. I also like the use of the 6 screws which hold the bezel in place, which according to a video I watched posted by Orient, those 6 screws aren't just there to look cool, they do hold the bezel in place. And for me personally, I always do enjoy seeing parts of the watch that serve a purpose rather than just being there for style points. I do like that little bit of industrial touch with the 6 screws. The crown is a screw-down type with a significant crown guard protecting it. The crown is done in black to match the bezel and dial, which I think is a nice touch and nice contrast to the rest of the case. It also has deeply machined grooves which make gripping the crown really easy. The movement in this watch is a mechanical in-house movement from Orient called caliper 46J53. It's an automatic movement with no hand winding option, which for me personally is a negative, but some people don't mind shaking the watch for 2 minutes to get it to run when it runs out of power reserve. Okay. So for those people, I guess it's not such a big deal. The movement holds 40 hours of power when fully wound. The look of the movement through the exhibition case window isn't spectacular or the type of movement that you get lost in while you're staring at it, but it's not bad either. The rotor is decorated with Orient's logo as well as the caliper number and 23 jewels. And Orient did do a minimal but noticeable amount of work to the plates behind the rotor to give it a mildly decorated appearance.
That is fantastic! Dude!
As for the accuracy of this movement, I didn't put this one on the scope, but I can tell you that I've worn it for 6 days, and it isn't even 1 minute off in either direction, which means that it's running at an impressive minimal loss or gain. So it's definitely a solid and accurate movement. As for the look of the movement from the front when observing the small seconds hand in the sub-dial at 6 o'clock, it's kind of hard to gauge just how smooth the look of the movement is using a dial and a hand so small, but to the naked eye, by what I can see, the movement isn't choppy or inconsistent, it has a smooth precision look to it. Speaking of the sub-dial, let's move on to the dial. Under the flat sapphire crystal, yes, sapphire crystal, you have a dial with a ton of depth, a good amount of complexity, yet enough restraint to be almost simple looking. The dial itself is carbon fiber, and not plastic or something with a carbon fiber graphic. It's actual carbon fiber. And the use of this high-end material gives the dial a great 3D look and some added depth beyond the surface of the dial. At the outer edge, there's a stepped design, with the outermost ring containing a small but very easy to read minute track, and the ring below that containing tiny rectangles of lume for finding the hours in the dark. Just below that on the dial itself, you have applied hour markers which are thick and beautifully polished and shaped. Then over by the 3 o'clock, you have a thin Orient logo applied to the dial with automatic and 100 meters under that. The hands are large, polished, sword-shaped hands filled with lume, and in my opinion, they're just the right length for this dial. Now onto the sub-dials, and sadly this is where the praises stop on this dial. If you subtract all 3 sub-dials, the consistency, quality, aesthetic balance, and precision look of the parts as a whole is undoubtedly top quality and in my opinion, very undervalued. But then you look at the sub-dials, which before I get into what the issues are, here's the quick layout. The sub-dial at 12 o'clock is a power reserve indicator, the sub-dial at 9 o'clock is a date indicator, and the sub-dial at 6 o'clock is a running seconds dial. So what's wrong with these dials? First, I don't appreciate circular date indicators, especially not ones this small. It doesn't allow you to read the date quickly, but rather it forces you to look closely at the dial and count from the closest printed indicator, which is the 10, 20, or 31 you see printed there. So although not a useless sub-dial, a date window would have been a lot more functional. Now, if you recall, the last watch I reviewed, the Citizen Calendrier, that also had a circular sub-dial for the date, and I didn't complain about that. The big difference there is although I'd still rather have a date window than a date sub-dial, the sub-dial itself on the Calendrier was a lot larger, and it had printed numerals for all of the dates 1 through 10, then printed numerals for every other from the 10th to the 31st. And those two big differences make reading the date on the Calendrier as opposed to on this watch almost as fast and simple as using a date window. Big difference between that sub-dial and the one on the Enforcer. Next is the random haphazard layout of these 3 sub-dials. The second sub-dial is larger than the date sub-dial, which I actually appreciate, but the polished ring around that sub-dial literally overlaps the polished ring around the date sub-dial, which gives the visual impression that those 2 sub-dials just don't actually fit on this dial. Then the power reserve sub-dial is a great shape and size, but for some reason they decided to make the curved underside of the ring around that sub-dial thicker than the rings around the other 2 sub-dials, which aesthetically just makes no sense.
I don't get it.
Then you have the hands for the sub-dials, more inconsistencies. The date and seconds indicators have thin, stick-shaped red hands, while the power reserve indicator has a tapered, polished hand, which has a useless amount of lume in the thicker section, which you'll see on camera later, then a red tip at the end. They should have went with one style or the other and used that one style on all 3 sub-dials in my opinion. Then there's the issue of the look of the hands themselves. While the whole case, dial, indices, main hands all look very high quality, when you look closely at the hands in the sub-dials, especially the hands in the seconds and date sub-dials, they look moderately cheap. They're paper thin and the red coating almost looks like Krylon spray paint. The printing on these sub-dials is of fairly good quality though and very legible, so it's not all bad. And honestly, to the untrained, not so picky eye, nobody would see these sub-dials and think they're subpar as compared with the rest of the watch, so it's a subtle failure in execution, I'd say. If they would have used a date window at 9 o'clock instead of the wheel, and would have used better looking hands for the seconds and power reserve sub-dials, I honestly don't think I would have had almost anything to criticize on this dial. Otherwise, it's pretty damn good. Now, do the sub-dials ruin this watch for me? No, I haven't looked down at this watch once and said, damn, what a train wreck. It's just the type of thing that bothered me and didn't work upon a lot closer inspection, because obviously I'm reviewing the watch, not just wearing it. Let's talk about the bracelet. The bracelet was actually the first thing I was drawn to when I received this watch. It's a 3-link design, but not your standard round edge 3-link design. These links have a handsome, rugged, masculine kind of geometric machining which creates these striking angles rather than your boring old standard bracelet curves. Mix that with the brushed finishing broken up by the beautifully polished outer edges of the center links, and what you have is a bracelet that just plain looks expensive and high quality. The clasp is also well done. It's a double locking clasp with your standard lock over top, then a 2-button deployant clasp underneath. The Orient name and logo is fairly well engraved on the clasp as well. And one of my favorite things they included are the 3 fine adjustment positions for getting the size of the bracelet just right on your wrist after you've added or removed links to your preferred size. The only thing I don't like about the bracelet is the hinge where the 2 sides of the clasp meet. It feels a bit flimsy and has a bit of play to it when the watch isn't on your wrist. But with that said, there is no play or cheap feel to this bracelet when you have the watch on. The thickness, weight, and overall feel of this bracelet is pretty impressive and has a good balance with the fairly weighty case. As a related side note, the bracelet is 24mm at the lugs, tapering down to 22mm down by the clasp, and is a rather impressive 3.5mm thick.
Thick enough to stand up on its own.
The lume on this watch isn't fantastic. As you'll see there on screen, the minute and hour hands have very generous and fairly bright lume fillings, but the tiny rectangular lume markers above the hour indices are dull and minute in comparison. I'm also not really sure why the power reserve indicator has that tiny sliver of lume in it at all, and I've noticed that without purposely charging the lume directly under a light source, like I did here before this shot, if you rely on the lume for general light-to-dark applications such as walking out of the office into a dark parking lot, for example, the lume isn't very strong, and without a purposeful direct light charge, it doesn't last very long. Lastly, let's discuss the wrist presence and my overall impressions of this watch. Looking down at the Enforcer on the wrist, the dimensions just look perfect on my 7-inch wrist. The length and width of the lugs, the shape and diameter of the case, and the aesthetics of the bezel and dial are altogether a pleasing combination and one that I've had zero complaints with. I'm not in love with the thickness though. It's not over the top thick or uncomfortable, but for my personal taste, this would have rode the wrist a bit better and looked a little bit sleeker if it were down around 12 millimeters thick rather than somewhere over 13. But again, it's not far too tall, it's just a little bit taller than I like personally. The balance, although very slightly top heavy, is very good, and the overall weight of this piece is significant enough to remind you that you're wearing something of good, solid quality throughout the day. Overall, I've been very happy with the look and feel of this piece while I've had it. Speaking of the look of this watch, Orient markets this as a sport watch, and I'd say that they hit the mark. The carbon fiber dial and the sporty red hands on the black dials, and that little bit of mechanical industrial look of the silver screws through the black bezel do say sport watch. Yet it's not overdone or cheesy. It doesn't look like it's supposed to be part of a race car. Touches are clear but subtle enough. And it also does a good job of fitting multiple looks and styles. It's simple and subdued enough that it looks the part with, say, jeans and a t-shirt, yet it does have enough class and elegance to it to look the part with, say, a button-down and a blazer. It's not dressy enough to be a tux watch or anything like that, so I mean, that's where you kind of draw the line. But anything between t-shirt and blazer, you can definitely wear this watch. And of course, let me not forget about the price. Don told me that when he bought it, let's see here, the watch retailed for around 600 bucks, and I can't seem to find an MSRP on this watch almost anywhere on the internet. Either I don't know how to use Google or there just isn't one, but Amazon shows about $512, so it's definitely a mid-priced watch. Now, would I say that this watch is worth $500-ish? Actually, I would. In my honest opinion, this watch shows that Orient can hold their own in the market of well-made mechanical automatic watches. Even if you were to compare this watch to one of the biggest big buzz brands from Japan, which is Seiko, I could say with confidence that the fit, finish, quality, and accuracy of this piece could go toe-to-toe with most mechanical Seiko automatics on the market. And some of those can run $800 and higher, so I'd say that the price point for the Orient Enforcer is a pretty good value if it fits your aesthetic preferences. Rating this watch on a scale from 1 to 10 Mike Tysons, I would give it 8.5 Mike Tysons. Definitely a solid piece and a show of craftsmanship from a brand that a lot of people seem to dismiss as cheap or subpar because of their cheap prices and their almost endless variety of watches. Good stuff. If you have one of these watches or an Orient or any watch that you want to talk about, leave a comment down below. Make sure you subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed this video. Share it with other watch lovers. If you want to support this channel, the link to my Patreon page is right down there at the top of the video description. And yeah, that's it. Okay.